that's okay. He's done a great job. Okay. So, oh, thank you. You can do it. Right. I'll sit over here. Oh, no, because this came from a uni lecture. I've given you objectives, so that will freak you out, won't it? Fancy having learning objectives in a Feldenkrais session. So we're going to go over what the broad church of neuroscience is, why it might be relevant. You can be astonished and understand that our understanding of the nervous system is evolving and it's constantly being added to or altered. And I usually give the example here where we used to teach a neuroscience program for teachers. And I remember literally driving to the lecture and, you know, listening to Radio National or something. No, it wasn't. I'd heard it that day at work. Someone had brought in that there'd been something in my lecture about this thing called the God spot. Some of you might have heard about it in the brain. There was some research that suggested that there was a God spot, meaning it was somewhere in the sort of temporal lobe, so in the side of the brain. Yeah, God, as in the Almighty, God the Almighty. That, not the G spot. Is that what you were thinking? No. Oh. So there was this kind of this paper. I just wondered where your brain was going. There was this paper where they did an experiment where they would put somebody in a room by themselves, and there was a painting on the wall of a boat, a ship on the water, and they'd put the person in the room. They'd sit with that ship for a while, and then they would describe the ship. And under the sort of control conditions, they'd just describe, oh yeah, it's a boat, if they knew what kind of boat or ship it was, you know, and a bit about the weather or something like that. And then the other people in the group, so the intervention group, they stimulated this part of the temporal lobe in the brain, put them in the room, and they described the picture in very spiritual terms, like, you know, the boat was, and I'm making this up, but it's something like this, that, you know, the boat was a symbol of God's love, and it was strong, and it was, you know, storming the tempest sea, you know, withstanding the stormy and tempestuous sea and all that sort of stuff. So they put a really religious, perhaps even a spiritual dimension to the painting. So therefore, the authors suggested that this stimulating this part of the brain made the person more likely to have a religious bent. So this was an interesting paper, and everyone thought, this is amazing. So they called this spot the God spot. Now, nobody has ever replicated that study. And that literally the day that I was meant to be lecturing, and I had that slide, the slide about the God spot in here, I had to say to the students, literally today for the first time I've heard that this has been rejected. This notion of the God spot is now no longer thought to be valid. Great. So there is no God spot. There's a God spot, there's no God spot. So that's a long-winded story for saying that what you hear today about the brain quite possibly will be refuted tomorrow, literally. So therefore, if you want to, you know, being confident about the way the brain works is probably not a healthy pursuit, because we're in a constant state of having to relearn stuff. And this whole lecture, therefore, is a little bit about trying to help us to not attach too much to what the current theories are. So, next slide, please. Oh, I took out. Yeah, no, our practice now. Yeah. I rewrote these in the kitchen 5 minutes ago. So there's some basic assumptions. Is what we understand of the brain influences the way we interact with others, and this is from a practice point of view, as well as a general life point of view. So if we think brains are computers, we treat people like that, with inputs and outputs and data and all that sort of stuff. If we think that people are organised hierarchically and we're basically a reptilian brain superseded by a mammalian brain superseded by a human brain, we will be looking for the lizard creature in everybody that won't be there. It's not there. So, so it's important to actually contemplate what you think the brain is like. And sort of the neuroplasticity stuff, even though I'm rude about Norman Doidge, what has been fantastic about it is that people had a belief that the brain was fixed. And therefore, as Moshe Feldenkrais said, that if you've got, well, I'm paraphrasing, but he wasn't, the flexible brain was what he was after. But if people had a basic assumption that the brain wasn't flexible, then how could they engage in a method that was promoting a flexible brain? Now we know the brain is flexible, i.e. plastic. So we are now in a much more fertile world for Feldenkrais than we were 15, 20 years ago when people thought that the brain was fixed. So it's important that when you're working with clients, that somehow you get a bit of a handle on what their perceptions of the brain and their behaviour are. And Ramon and I were talking about this, if you don't mind me talking about your mum, like if your mum's got a fixed idea about how things are, that's the mind that you have to work with, and how do you sneak around that, for example? I mean, I'm sure your mum's not as fixed-minded as lots of other people that we know, but do you know what I mean? Like we need to know what their stance is on things, because that's what we're working with. We're not selling our stance, we're getting them to be aware of their stance, and then if they can possibly shift. Okay, so what other people understand of their brain is important to know. This was from a train ticket when I was an undergrad. If the brain was simple enough for us to understand, we would be too simple to understand it. I haven't caught trains for a very long time. I was an undergrad a very long time ago, and that's still true. It is still truly the most complicated structure in our world. So, how can we possibly think that we can understand all of it? However, we need to try to understand it, particularly in how it learns and how it develops from prenatal through to successful aging, and how it controls our behaviour. And here, I mean, thoughts, feelings, senses and actions. So that's our 4 big domains that we talk about in Feldenkrais: sensing, thinking, feeling and doing in different environments. So what makes us tick? Beep. So when when I say I'm a neuroscientist, I don't often say it because it sounds a bit wanky, but I would say I'm a clinical neuroscientist, because my understanding of the brain is more from when it goes wrong than from when it goes right, to be honest. However, I've worked with colleagues who are very cellular, so they're called neuroscientists, but they would have no idea about what we're talking about now in terms of neuroscience. This is a different world, because they're talking about, at the level of sodium channels and, that kind of stuff, and what turns a sodium channel on and off and all this sort of stuff, or at the molecular level in that sense. So, but they're still neuroscientists. Systems neuroscientists are, looking more at, the systems of the brain, like the sensory system or the motor system or something like that. Behavioural is probably where we feel quite comfortable, in that we're looking at the way the brain organises behaviour, so how it manifests at a human level. And then cognitive, obviously, is honing in more on the thinking. Now, obviously, I could add heaps to this slide, like clinical neuroscience. There's all sorts of weird neurosciences, entrepreneurial neuroscience, and I don't know, what's your favourite wanky neuroscience things at the moment? It's a bit off the boil now, isn't it, neuroscience? No, not still on the boil. Oh, yeah, with the brain. Yeah, yeah.
Before, when you were talking about pattern recognition and
novelty detection.
And novelty, yeah. If you think, or neuroscience may view that as an inherent quality of brain activity.
Seems to be.
Yeah.
I
guess.
Yeah, it seems to be 2 of the most fundamental kinds of ways of processing. Yeah. Whether it's visual or auditory or kinesthetic, like we're doing, like movement, it seems to hold true. So if you think about music, so something that you hear, so it's an auditory stimulus. you know a piece of music, and if someone just went in there and tweaked one note, you would know instantly, because you've got that pattern recognition, and then you pick up the thing that, and you think about, you know, in a one piece of music, you're probably listening to 1,000 notes. How the hell did your brain pick out that 1 out of 1,000 has changed? But it does easily.
Yeah.
That's why I hate listening to those Christmas carols, you know, at the Domain, where they dick around with the songs. Oh, it's so frustrating, because your brain's just so into pattern recognition. I love Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Stop doing that fancy business. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's what our brains do. They love that. It's why we love music, a lot of us, is that getting into the pattern business.
Yeah, because it almost seems like that's also, you know, that process can either be the trap or the freedom.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. It can be a trap, absolutely, because we keep looking for the pattern in it.
And particularly if there's not a good balance of those two together, like if it's all just pattern recognition, that's just like the habit building.
Yeah.
And if we're not working in novelty of it, it's very rigid and a tough pattern to sort of play with.
And I think that's the nub of it with the brain, is finding the balance in those two things. It's the absolute nub of it. Absolutely. Because pattern recognition to its extreme, it's, you know, confirmation bias. So every young man with long hair is a git. You know, and I'm going to see that pattern, and I'm going to look for it. And I'm going to look for it, and I'm going to actually not see a young man with long hair who's not a git. I just won't see them, because I'm so intent on that pattern recognition, confirmation, perception bias. Do you know? So it's where racism comes from. Actually, I'll dig out this great YouTube. Sorry.
Okay.
I get the Tangent Award.
Thank you.
All right. So hold on to that. Okay, so the historical brain. So here's some ways that people have thought about the brain in the past. The first known description of the brain was found in an Egyptian papyrus from 3000 BC. However, interestingly, the Egyptians, you know how they had sort of certain symbolism for certain organs, and they would really carefully extract the organs and preserve them in those canopic jars. I don't know how to say canopic. Is it canopic? Canopic. The brain, they very carefully extracted, and they threw it out because they didn't think it was important. So some of the trepanning techniques, so neurosurgical techniques for getting into the skull and into the brain, that the Egyptians used are still used now. So they were incredibly sophisticated surgically, but they would remove the brain in this very sophisticated way and then chuck it out. Whereas they'd preserve other organs because they were thought to be important for the afterlife. So they didn't recognise its importance. They recognised it, but they didn't recognise its importance. And then in medieval times, there is some evidence, don't ask me what, about a recognition that some human attributes, like thinking and even the spirit, were in the cranial vault, so within the head, and particularly in the ventricles. So I don't think I've got a good picture of the brain. I'll put one up tomorrow. So we've got obviously the grey matter and the white matter of the brain, and you know it's in sort of two walnut halves here, and a bit of funny business at the back and a bit of funny business underneath. And within those two halves, the two kind of walnut sections, are gaps, and they're called ventricles. And within the ventricles is a thing called cerebrospinal fluid. And it bathes the brain, and it circulates through these little caverns in the brain, and it goes all the way down spinal cords to bathe the spinal cord, because that's contiguous with the brain. And there's a bunch of functions for it's called CSF. So if anyone's ever had a lumbar puncture, that's what they are extracting, the cerebrospinal fluid. So in medieval times, they thought that this CSF was the spirit, because it circulated, I presume. I was in gaps. I don't know. I wasn't there. Next. Now, this bugger, Descartes, that you've all heard about, he created problems which we're still dealing with. And he was the guy in the early 17th century who said that the mind and the brain were very different things. Yes.
I think that's where I am.
Yeah. He wasn't all bad. No, it wasn't all bad. Like the rest of us, just, and you know, he was thinking, and at least he had the conversation going, I guess. And he talked about this funny little tiny place in the brain called the pineal gland. And he decided it was special because everything in the brain is replicated one side and the other. You know, like I've said, the two halves of the two walnuts. And everything is roughly symmetrical if you look at it macroscopically, except for the pineal gland, which is right in the middle, and there's only one of them. So he thought that therefore it must be very significant. And therefore, and because consciousness, is the most significant attribute we have, that's therefore where consciousness and the soul were. And the rest of the brain was just this kind of receiver mechanism to take in information. And we had this consciousness soul business happening right in the middle. So this word Cartesian dualism is still pervasive. We still have the Department of Psychology is in a different building to the Department of Anatomy because bodies and minds are still relatively separate in many institutional ways, and also in many in the way we think. And you know, the New Age stuff was kind of a blessing and a curse in a way, wasn't it? Is that it made people think about the mind and the body as together, but because it was seen as New Age, therefore it's been quite easy for orthodoxy to dismiss it as well. So we're still dealing with a lot of people in the orthodox health system who actually, when push comes to shove, think the mind and the body are different. What don't you say? Wouldn't you say as a psych? Yeah. So, and even, I've worked with psychologists who are like that, that they don't get that the body's kind of important to the mind and the mind is kind of important to the body. But anyway, so just to be aware of that and respectful that if that's someone's understanding, you have to work with their understanding from a point of their understanding in that sense. Okay, here's another funny old dude, Franz Gall, in the early 19th century. So this science of phrenology, to Descartes. Yeah. It's not that it's significant. It's significant, but it's more to do with hormonal regulation. Yeah. Not the soul. Franz Gall. So you might have seen these funny ceramic heads with the zones on them. So that comes from phrenology, where Gall and others zoned the brain, like the skull actually, because he assumed that the brain underneath the skull was related to the skull, which is where he went wrong. But anyway, that if you felt someone's skull and you felt where they had dips and bumps, and then you correlated that with his overall map of the skull, that you could diagnose people's attributes. You could also diagnose illnesses, but you could pick their attributes. And as I've said there, the mistake in his thinking is that the skull and the brain are related, and of course they're not. However, he was the first one to think about that maybe the different parts of the brain had different functions, which is somewhat correct. So have I got another slide about that? Oh, no, I haven't. So if you look in, if you can just Google phrenology and you'll find out, I always remember the combat zones are here. So if you've got protuberances back here, you might be very combative. But interesting, I think the love zone is just above them. So I was thinking, that would be interesting that love and combat are close together. But anyway, so it had all those kinds of things that you could pick someone's personality traits by where they had bumps on their head. So we don't believe that anymore either. Now, the earlier 20th century was when they started to do more sort of electrophysiology and zap the brain, and they made some fantastic discoveries, but they also made a lot of assumptions from their experiments with cats in particular, a bit of dog work and a bit of rat work, but often cats and rabbits. And they decided that the brain is hierarchical, which is not untrue. It's just not quite as simple as they liked it to be. So here in this part of the brain, this brain that has been sort of pulled apart a little bit. So if we look at, so they came up with this thing about, so here's the two halves of the walnut. So normally they sit together like that. And inside here is a lot of other things, but the limbic system in particular. So you can see how everything's reproduced one side, same. And then underneath it, same, split down the middle, it's the same, is the sort of the lower part of the brain. So here's called the cortex and the neocortex up the top, these curly bits. This mid-brainy kind of thing is the limbic system. This is mid-brain a bit too, and brainstem. And then this kind of cauliflower thing at the back is the cerebellum. So that's nestled back here. So they called this the reptilian brain, they called this the mammalian brain, and they called this the human brain, so the neocortex. Because actually if you look at it phylogenetically, so from a species point of view, a reptilian brain that's what a reptile has, that bottom bit. And then mammals have that bit and a bit of limbic system and a bit of cortex. And obviously the more you go up the species chain, like primates have a bigger and bigger cortex, and then as the sort of uber primate, we've got a neocortex as well. So they thought that this was significant, and therefore that we go through these sort of species development. So there's a whole developmental theory about this, that as little neonates we go through a reptilian stage, and that's where we're primarily operating from a reptile brain. And then we have a mammalian stage, and then we have a human stage. So as I've written there was this kind of layering or a hierarchy where the human part of the brain controlled the mammalian and the mammalian controlled the reptile. But if you unmasked it, so if you had damage in the human brain, basically you start acting like a mammal sort of thing. So I'm being fairly flippant about it. But it was certainly the pervasive thinking when I went through university as an undergrad. And a lot of the sort of neurophysio techniques that came out of that period, so the 50s, were based on this kind of hierarchical thinking, hierarchical theory and reflex theory, theories of motor control. So therefore, our work as therapists was about, so we had this view that the reflexes were uncovered after stroke, and people had to learn to suppress or inhibit reflexes. So we literally had things like reflex inhibiting postures and stuff like that. Now, of course, all that's shit now, and we don't do it because it's not true, because the brain is not hierarchical. It's not a longitudinal. We don't have a dominance of the cortex. The cortex only winks in and out when we need it. Actually, most of the time, we are operating out of brainstem, because that's where all of our vegetative functions are. And our conscious brain, we have an illusion that it's in control all the time, but it's not. It's just not. And we're playing around with the conscious brain with this awareness training, but it's really tiring. If we operated in that kind of, with that so-called human control all the time, we'd be exhausted. I've got clients who have to do it because they've got damage in their brainstem or in their midbrain or whatever, and they have to work cortically all the time, and they're bloody exhausted because they have to think about every step. So this hierarchical stuff is not a useful way of thinking. However, you will still hear people talking about it in that sense. Now, it is true phylogenetically that the neurology of lower order species is similar. So it's not completely untrue. It's just that we probably extrapolated it too much in the a couple of decades ago. Is that sort of clear? Is that a bit confronting for some folk? No? I've worked with therapists. I remember working with a little boy, and he was seeing I don't even know what kind of therapist it was. I had him just drawing, he was really weak around his hip joints. He had a brain hemorrhage. And I had him on his tummy, and his homework was to practice drawing his knee up this side and then drawing his knee up this side. which you could say is vaguely reptilian. And this therapist rang me up and blasted me and said, you're going through the reptilian stage too early. We're still at the, I don't know, fish stage or something. And I'm going, what the hell are you talking about? I'm just trying to get him to activate his glutes and his hip flexors. Like, what? And, she was telling me off for skipping a stage and going into reptilian control. And it's like, well, if lady, sorry, if that's your belief, that's your belief, that's really fine. And, yeah. Well, she was something weird. It wasn't something. She was something not weird, something complementary and alternative. So I don't know where she got her training from. And no, that the hierarchical stuff. This is where it gets a bit awkward because that's what Bobos was based on, but now Bobos is based on something else.
Disturbingly, you'll still see that approach in America, which is getting into the complex details of it, neurodevelopmental technique, which
is it still there?
Yep, sadly so. And it's still linked with what is known as Bobos. Yeah, it's very disturbing.
Yeah. I mean, I just wish Bobos would change its name, to be honest.
They've tried. It's been a big discussion. About 6 years ago, it was on the international committee. But they've put it to the side.
Because my only experience of Bobos was an undergrad, and it was all reflex inhibiting postures.
Yeah, that's not ever been my experience.
No, and that's why Bobos would roll in their collective ovens if they. Sorry, bad joke. Anyway, okay, so there's so you'll still see some textbooks about the hierarchical brain, and now the important thing is that sometimes Moshe will write in a way about talk a little bit in that way as well, because his neuroscience came from the 50s and 60s as well. Now interestingly, he does get a bit interested in reflexes in a way that we're probably not that interested in reflexes anymore. So you just need to remember that a little bit in body and mature behavior, and where the other one. There's a little bit that makes me a bit cringy in the master moves, I think. However, it's not too bad. But I wouldn't take the specific neuroscience that Feldenkrais talks about seriously. The generalities of it, actually, he's foreseeing neuroplasticity in a way that is astonishing, like absolutely astonishing. Before there was any evidence, he was talking about flexible brains and all this sort of stuff. Because it came out of his experience, and then he tried to match it to the thinking of the day, which was all this sort of stuff. And it's not a good match. And I think I'd love to have talked to him about it. But so just to be aware, that we can only know what the times know, and I can be as smart alecky as I like. But the thing is, it's changed so fast. And like I said, I was trained in hierarchical motor control. So, and I'm not that old.
No. Susan, I'd encountered that this three-piece through a book on Mingyur Rinpoche, and it's called The Joy of Living.
Yeah. And
he was sort of marrying the neuroscientist view and this sort of structure.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because it was the why to the how the Buddhist practices work, or he was just talking about like compassion and things like this. And then saying so the reptilian brain or the autonomic reflexes or just the fight or flight or whatever
the autonomic stuff is still kosher. Yeah.
So there's this happening, and a general view that I'd held anyway was with the survival instinct thing being so almost brutal and barbarous or something like this, and that's just something I held. But I found it really interesting that he was saying as we're evolving or whatever, and the mammalian mind started coming about, that these aspects of play and of teaching, through various means of compassion and stuff is actually very wide in our DNA, as it evolved
Yeah.
And then now that this neocortex thing, which is very like imaginary, and that, you know, that capacity is like the newest sort of thing. And yeah, it was, I just found it really interesting.
He is worth a read, and he is well informed, and I agree. I think he writes about it in a very respectful way as well. And he has worked with some good neuroscientists. So he's one of the dudes that's had his brain scanned a lot for compassion practices and stuff. So he's not uninformed. And I think he writes really nicely about it. And from a phylogenetic perspective, you know, it is true, that structure of the brain. And roughly speaking, you know, those aspects do have those sorts of functions. The brainstem is very vegetative. And in that kind of a mammalian brain, the limbic system is all emotions and memory, you know, and our memory is extremely sophisticated. So it's not. I think what's not useful is to think about it as primitive, because otherwise we'll think that emotions are primitive. Maybe they are, and because they're all coloured by each other, and I think that's the point. I'll get to the sort of the how to bring it together. In the mid-20th century, there was psychosurgery. So this is the one flew over a cuckoo's nest kind of thing, where if people were misbehaving or had personalities that society didn't find particularly palatable, for just a very short period of history, and particularly in the States, but a little bit here, they would smash up the frontal lobes a bit, because they'd realised from various sorts of occurrences that the frontal lobes, you know, theoretically sort of neocortex, it had a lot to do with personality. So there was this classic guy called Phineas Cage, who was a railway worker who had a pike driven up through his frontal cortex. And so they knew none of his other part of his brain was damaged, well, sort of knew, except for this frontal thing. And they took the pike out, but his personality changed. So that, you know, it was occurrences like that that helped scientists, medical folk realise that the frontal lobes, so these big parts of the walnut up here, were important for personality and behaviour. Now, of course, they're not the only. Behaviour can get influenced by any other part of the brain as well, so it's not as simple as that. But let's say these guys thought it was. So they would just, you know, there's the quote, a medical ice pick through, so that if you look at the skeleton, the roof of the eyeball is really thin, and you can just pop it up there, because the brain doesn't have any sensation. You didn't even need to anaesthetise anybody. And then they just wiggle it around, apparently, cut through a whole lot of frontal tracks, and that's it. And he could do it in about 2.5 minutes. Like, he used to time himself, this one particular guy. And you think again, well, this is a while ago, but I heard an interview not that long ago about a guy who had this surgery done. He didn't know because it was done to him as a boy. And when he reflected on why he would have had it done, is probably he had something like ADHD, what we would now know as ADHD. So this is maybe 10 years ago. I heard him interviewed on the radio. He would have been in his 50s, maybe 60. And when he found out about this stuff, then then his family recognised that that's what had happened to him, because these travelling surgeons would just come through offering this service for very flat affect, very concrete thinking often. So, you know, that's a classic for the bits of the frontal lobe that are just above the eye. You know, so difficulty thinking laterally, probably very vague, rigid, emotionally very flat affect. Poor kid is probably just a lively kid. So, you know, that's not that long ago. So that's that. Next one. The historic brain continued, still in the 20th century. So let's go to the 60s. And there's a lot of experimentation, realising that the brain was actually chemical as well. So you could change the way the brain functioned. You could change behaviour. You could change consciousness. You could change all sorts of things, cognition, through manipulating brains chemically. So all the sort of amazing experiments with LSD and other, the hallucinogens and all that sort of stuff. The experiments or the drugs? Yeah. It's very controversial, isn't it? Like, I feel really caught at work because I've got a couple of colleagues who are really, really, really anti the cannabis stuff, medicinal cannabis. And I saw a great documentary that actually convinced me the other way, that it sounds like there's something in it. But it's still, I don't understand. The medical profession are really anti it. But I mean, they're drug peddlers themselves. So I'm not quite sure what the problem is. So I do struggle with what makes one drug kosher and another drug not kosher. I do struggle with that. All the drugs have side effects, exactly. Yeah, and this whole problem with if we have medicinal cannabis, it will make illicit cannabis. Well, I mean, Tasmania grows opium very happily under very controlled conditions for medicinal reasons. Like, it's not insurmountable. So I'm perplexed by the problem, and I'm perplexed why the medical establishment are so anti, when they just let any other kind of shit into people's systems, and they're happy to experiment with these extraordinary drugs for cancer and the side effects of cancer in other ways that have disgusting side effects and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, like this latest round of stuff in the PBS. So I'm genuinely confused. That's my answer. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Yes. Maybe it's the control issue. But no, medicinal cannabis they had the good gear taken out of it. Actually, like, it's actually benign. It doesn't do anything for you. Maybe it's a murky world, the world of pharma. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, really? When they have a high from that? Ah. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, look, I think, this is, we're at a real junction in understanding the chemical nature of the brain, because it's not like the same chemical will have the same effect on your brain that it does on mine, because it's very clear that it doesn't. And so this whole idea about personalised medicine and why an opioid for you reduces your pain and for me increases my pain, or something like that, which is what's coming out, and how to predict that. I think the pharmaceutical world is going to be turned up on its ass, because it's made some big assumptions about the chemical nature of the brain. And I think because we've had this primitive understanding, our understanding of the chemical nature of the brain, and particularly in relation to, my genetics versus yours, and why I respond to something differently to you, we're at the moment where it's primitive. We're actually wandering around in the wilderness, and in 20 years' time, if I give this lecture, we will know so much more about why that is, and we'll look back to these days when we were all given OxyContin as a universal painkiller as absolutely daft. It'll be daft, but I don't know what yeah. Okay, so then people farted around with the brain being a computer. It's not, though computers may be getting more like the brain, who knows? And this idea about a combination of modular and networking. So why I've got these beautiful slides up is that these are the new images that are starting to be produced. So if you think about the old MRIs, which are about regions of interest, and you'd look at, where blood flow increased in the brain under certain conditions, and you get a region that lit up. Now they're mapping actually how those regions connect. So see that beautiful picture up the top is that slice of the brain done this way. So we're looking at the two halves of the walnut and the connections between the two hemispheres. So that's the corpus callosum, that big thick bunch of purple fibers up the top, and then the red bits sort of the brainstem, and the colours are coded for the direction of the tracks. And this is done by diabolical things, seeding impulses and putting it all together in a composite kind of way. The three pictures down the bottom are kind of illustrations of the connectivity for I can't remember now where I got those pictures from, but, a function like, for example, speech, and how, we thought that the speech center was here and the language center was here, and it was all in the left side. But actually, when you really map activity when you're talking languages, both hemispheres, but they do have specialized functions, but it's not like the right hemisphere is quiet when we're undergoing speech and language tasks. They doing other things like maybe that, the voice pitch and the timing of the words, so the spatial orientation of the words will be more right hemisphere. But it's the whole brain, not all of the brain, but many parts of the brain, even in these very modular functions, if that makes sense. So we're just at this sort of, we've flipped from thinking that the brain is very zoned, and the sort of in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they were busy mapping the brain in terms of these very discrete zones. Then people started to realise, the zones are a bit more connected than that, and now they're actually mapping the connections. And it's maybe the strength of the connections that's actually really important. So that's this connectivity stuff. Next.
Susan, we had a reading in the last homework about maps in the brain of different, lots of different maps in the brain mapping different functions. So how does that fit in with, and that seemed to be a little bit based on the compartmentalization of the brain. Or is that still a valid?
I meant to read that article. I won't answer it until I've read the article, because I'm not quite sure what they were talking about. I didn't read the article yet. So if I read, do you remember which you told me about it? Which one was it?
It wasn't. We had to look at Moshe's book, and then what was the guy's name?
All right. I read the abstract, guy. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll read it and I'll get back to you about that one, because I don't want to dish it in case it's true. I don't know. Well, next week I'll talk about body schema and body image and what we understand from. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So we do. The answer is yes, we do. Of course, we create maps. They used to be called sort of engrams. We create all sorts of internal representations. So my old-fashioned language is an internal representation of things, and they are. You could see them very simplistically as a well-travelled set of pathways that we create, and we'll talk about body schema next week. Yeah. So the current brains, structurally, they haven't changed for about 100,000 years, so they're pretty successful. Evolution hasn't dicked around with them too much in 100,000 years. So what's happened is we've only just started to reach a physical age where we are seeing that the brain obviously wears out, and that's the dementia thing. So dementia is actually, it's not like people are getting dementia more. It's just that more people are living long enough for their brains to reach the stage of degenerating for whatever reason. And so it's not an epidemic in the sense that we're catching it or it's a new disease. It's sorry? It's because we're living older and more of us, yeah. So people always got dementia at a certain percentage. Now, it's not my area. I don't know if there's any way of telling whether it's a greater percentage but certainly the biggest risk factor for dementia is getting old. But the alternative to getting old is pretty hard, isn't it? The alternative to getting old is pretty shit. Okay, next. All right, so here's I've got some lovely videos to show of the brain later on. When you're feeling sleepy, you can kind of go to sleep to them. So we've got 10 to the power of 10 neurons, which I used to be able to say, all I say now is like a shitload of brain cells. So in the brain, we've got neurons, and they're the kind of functional communication cells of the brain. And you can see those stylized on the right there. So that big orangey thing in the middle, for example, that's a neuron with the cell body in the middle, and it's got these branches coming out. And some of the branches are called dendrites, and they're the little branches that receive input, and other branches are called axons, and they're the ones where the input gets passed out. So there's branches that receive information from another neuron, and then they've got branches that pass the information on to other neurons, if that makes sense. So let's say each neuron has about 10,000 neighbours, and let's say they can have a connection with each. That's another double 40 quadrillion crapload of possible communication pathways. And if each connection, which is called a synapse, has several strengths of communication. So it's not just I touch you, I don't touch you, but I can touch you in 10 different kind of strengths for 10 different levels of communication, which is probably an underestimation. We have 10 to the trillionth power of possible electrochemical configurations. Now, very simplistically, you could say that a couple of synapses is a thought. You could say that. Or an action. Or an emotion. So that is a crap load of thoughts or actions or emotions. So this is, and of course not all of them would be functional, but I think about those numbers sometimes. I think, if you just had a storm in your brain and just they all fired off, well, that's called epilepsy. It's totally non-functional. We just get this random firing of these synapses, and it's because it's not orchestrated, it just comes out as an epileptic seizure. Isn't it just the most extraordinary miracle that I can control these messages and sit here and be approximately intelligible? I mean, it's just amazing, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, that 0 or the 1. Yeah.
So quantum computing is really about being able to elicit more than one choice when a computer is making a decision between yes or no, 0 or 1.
0 or 1. Yeah.
To being able to do 0 between 3 or 4 or 10.
And we have got that in spades, that ability that for connections to be stronger or weaker or more likely to fire or not likely to fire. So, this means that our potential is extraordinary. However, it also means that it can break down. And I just think it's a miracle that it doesn't break down more often. Okay, so these internal neural networks, you could call them a neural network, you could call them internal representations, you could call them maps, have the ability to communicate between each other dynamically. So these neurons, and of course we're using these neurons to reflect on the activity of neurons. Like as you're listening to me now, it's neurons that are firing off that allow you to locate my voice, hear the sounds, recognize the sounds as words, translate those words into meaning, match them with what you understand of that meaning, do this, or have I heard that before? Oh, that's new. That kind of recognition stuff, and then make sense of it. And then there's all that complex thing about, are you going to remember it or not? And how am I going to encode that to have a memory so that when I give you a test tomorrow on this, that you'll all get full marks because you've actually encoded it neurologically. So I've got this whole bunch of neurons busy communicating, and we've found this way through language and through touch of communicating with other sets of neurons for ATM and FI. It's marvellous. Next. So current thinking, and, you know, I'm willing to update this slide at any moment, that, you know, like any one of those previous notions has something in it that is of interest, which is why I put them all in there. It's not like they've been refuted 100%. Maybe 99.9 in some instances, but, you know, they were all interesting ideas and approximations of understanding. So, you know, I can make jokes about them, but really why I give this talk is that I want people to be respectful of the journey of knowledge that we've got, and that it's an ongoing thing. So we've got these interesting combinations of modular. So of course, there are regional functions of the brain, and they're highly networked. So that my speech centre and my language centre are highly networked with the opposite hemisphere in terms of having that speech have a timing and a rhythm, which are the spatial characteristics of speech. You know, so it's not as regional as we thought. It's networked, and the networks support each other. And this is what we call parallel and distributed. So rather than saying that the brain now is hierarchical, where the top dominates, the top is the top dog, and the bottom is subservient, we now say that these functions are parallel and distributed, which fits in with those pictures that I showed you. There's a lot of connectivity, yes, that goes longitudinally between the top and the bottom, so to speak, but there's just as much connectivity from left to right and from front to back, and in fact every shade in between, because, you know, if they're mapping, I can't remember, is it, you know, the blue path, is the purely up and down path would be, let's say, blue, and the red is purely left and right, and green, yellow is front and back, or something like this. There's actually no pure colours in those connectivity maps. They're all kind of angling around. So if you want a visual piece of evidence that we're not hierarchical, look at those maps and you'll be convinced. So distributed meaning that some regions, but there's lots of things that don't have a region. The function of them emerges out of a network. So pain is one, which we can talk about. And we understand this because of all these different imaging and electrophysiological things that we can do, and then map them with what we see, the person's behaviour. So we can map behaviour with what we can visualise in the brain without killing people or doing it post-mortem or shoving a pike in their head. I left that one in. That's a religious experience. I just left that in because it makes me laugh, because it's not true. But I think it's true. Someone might find the God spot again next week. We don't know. Now, pain is an important one. That there is no pain centre. There's no part of the brain that is responsible for sensing pain. It is a classically networked function. Though I was in a class the other day, not a fieldy class, where one of the people in the audience, someone mentioned something about pain, and they said, oh, well, you know, because of the pain centre, blah, blah, blah. And she spoke with great authority about the pain centre. And it wasn't my place to say you're talking something that nobody else believes in. So I just kept quiet. But, you know, there are odd notions around there. So my advice to you as practitioners is to not have hold on to this stuff pretty lightly. You know, because if you're talking absolutes, someone will shoot you down. So pain springs from activation of a whole network of areas. The motor area, so the movement part of the area, obviously the sensory parts of the brain which are spread throughout the brain, obviously emotional, so the limbic parts of the brain, obviously the memory parts of the brain, which is again networked throughout, all sorts of weird places. So therefore you can't just go into someone's brain and chop out the pain problem, because it is a networked thing. Okay, what's next?
I still don't understand that, because like pain when you feel it or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Is that just a non? highest stimulus that you get to?
Yes, yeah, it's a good question. So nociception, which is what you feel if I stuck a pin in your finger, that is a pain stimulus, and it stimulated particular receptors. We'll talk about this maybe tomorrow or next day. It stimulates particular receptors in your finger, and that fires off the nerve up through the spinal cord, and you register that in the somatosensory cortex and then further back as well, and it gets processed, and you go, oh shit, that hurts. In fact, it might be processed in the spinal cord, because if it really is painful, you don't even want your brain to think about it. You don't even want to be conscious of it. You want to move your finger away if it's hot or something. So it might lead to action and processing at a very low level in the nervous system because it's bad. But generally speaking, there you localize it. You know, there'll be some level of recognition that's not a good thing, and then an action plan will come out of that. I better get my finger away from that pin or whatever it is. Now, it's when pain gets complicated, it's like, let's say that pin is, you know, like my son who's got an absolute needle phobia. God knows where he's had hardly any needles in his life. He has been known to throw up on the bus when his female friends on the way to school were simply talking about their rubella injections. So he kind of identified with the pain of a needle when there wasn't even a needle in sight. So that clearly shows that there's this whole other bunch of brain stuff that's happening that's arisen from his memory of that, probably the 1 or 2 times he's ever had a needle jab and the pain associated with it. So that's the kind of networked, it's all the sort of crap around pain that is networked function. But a pure pain with a needle going in, it's relatively simple. Yeah. And it is literally just another sensation like that. So pain just gets so complicated because of all that emotional memory associations stuff. Yeah. Exactly. And why does my Eddie do that and my stepson? Well, maybe it's genetic. I'm not frightened of needles. I don't know where he gets it from. Yeah, he's a big sook. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Why is he so different? It's not. Maybe it's because the GP smacked him when he had his first needle. No, she didn't. Anyway, whatever. Yeah, we've all got our phobias. Yeah, why phobia and not a addiction sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, that's right. He'll get over it because he's that kind of boy now. Well, he's not a boy; he's a young man. Where he'll be keen to figure it out. Yeah. Really, how does one person blah 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 blah? How does learning take place at the synaptic level in parallel with the behavioural characteristics of learning? So how do we build up one synaptic pattern? And I remember that, the physiologist that taught us, he used to say, you wait, when I've sorted these sodium channels out, I'll be able to explain to you the mind of a terrorist. That's what he used to say. So he'd jump from the sodium channels to the behaviour of a terrorist. Well, it's probably a fair few steps in between, but anyway. Poor guy. He really suffered from bipolar. Interesting, isn't it? Anyway, there you go. What's next? So there's this idea about neural Darwinism, which is probably worth talking about a little bit. So this is one of the theories that came out in, late 1990s, 2000s, neural Darwinism, and a guy called Edelman. And it's an interesting way of thinking about how connections between neurons, that they will survive if it's useful, or they'll get junked, i.e. they won't survive if they're not useful. So if a thought is useful and you keep practicing the thought, then that connection gets stronger and it survives. So that's why it's called Darwinism. So it's survival of the fittest. The sort of the most useful brain patterns persist. Now, clearly, some things that we persist with are not that useful, but we keep practicing them. So there are that we do this confirmation of usefulness or not that will kind of not cement a particular set of connections, but strengthen it or junk it if it's not useful. So there's this idea about neural Darwinism, and we kind of pay a bit of attention to that in the sense that a one-off ATM is not likely to have a big change. It might, and occasionally it does, but actually it's about the ongoing practice, and it's about the consistency of engagement in a process that leads to a change in behaviour, as opposed to one-off wham bam thank you ma'am kind of thing. Now there are some patterns that are very strong. So we say more hardwired, but not completely hardwired. So there's very little that we actually inherit that we do automatically. And the way to think about this is that in other species, when that species is born, so think about a foal, for example, baby horse, it's born and then quite quickly it can walk. So that's clearly hardwired. It doesn't have to take an apprenticeship to learn it. It simply has to activate a pattern that is there, wired up, ready to go. It's like a TV dinner. You know, you just have to warm it up and it's there to eat. That's clearly not the case with us. There's almost nothing that we don't have to learn. Walking takes us on average 15 months, you know, and we have to go through a whole lot of apprenticeship and learning and development to get there. So therefore walking is not hardwired in us. It's a learned thing. However, there are only a certain number of ways that we can walk because of our biomechanics, and we are going to be influenced. You know, I always remember watching my niece walking and realising that she walked exactly like her mum. Now, is that partly genetic or is it copying because her mum was her thing? Yeah, they were very sexy about 15 years ago. I made a joke about them the other day, and one of the guys from the arts department had a go at me and said, "Oh, mirror neurons, get over yourself." We have resonance systems, which again we can talk about coming up. So think about them more as that my set of neurons has a bit of a predisposition to want to resonate with your neurons. Don't take that personally. We do it with everybody. You know, we have an ability to recognise each other in that sense, and it's at a very neuronal kind of level. So we'll come back to it. So speech, and we have particular periods of time when it's easier for our brains to learn speech and language than others. So there's sort of these critical periods, but it doesn't mean to say that we can't learn it later in life. It's just harder. Yeah. Okay. What else we got? We might stop there. So these, I think now we go into neuroplasticity. I'll just do this bit. So these connections, so these synapses are very plastic, and so plastic here means changeable. So even at birth, genetic twins have different brains due to differing influences of the fetal environment. So already our brain's development is influenced by things other than simply developing in and of itself. So those hierarchical theories, some of them are called neuromaturational theories, where brains developed phylogenetically, like from reptile to mammal to human, no matter what. And that was a dangerous way of thinking because it meant that the environment had no impact. And then all those poor Romanian babies who were deprived of an open environment grew up with very poor motor skills because they missed that critical period, and they were in an impoverished environment. So that was a really important understanding, that the opportunity for our brains to be exposed to different environments and different opportunities is vital for our brains to develop properly. So if we have an impoverished environment as a child and a baby, our brains will be impoverished. And again, that's why the neuromaturational stuff, that brains just mature like a foal's, it was very dangerous in terms of the rights of a child. So there's that stuff. And I just read something today. There's a new theory that they're investigating, that it might be the fetal environment that dictates left-handedness or right-handedness, about whether the child's left hemisphere ear is against the mum's tummy wall, or the right one. So it gets more stimulus from the light and the sound. How about that for a theory? How about that? So her left ear was against mum's wall? I don't know. I just read it, and there was just these scientists. Could be absolute bollocks next week. It's not proven. It's just a theory. You know, there's no evidence. It was just an idea. However, you know, the fetal environment has an impact, obviously. We know that from twins. Genes and environment combine to influence the brain's functions, and other processes that influence the brain. There's a lot of connections is not necessarily a good thing. So as our brains develop, you know, there's a period where there's a whole lot of synaptic sprouting, axonal sprouting, so lots of axons growing and dendrites, and lots of synapses being formed. There's some little graphs about it, and you get a peak at around like 4 years old, and another peak of number of synapses in your teens. And guess what's the behaviour of a 4-year-old and a teenager like? The same. And it would be chaotic. So there's this thing about learning that actually might not be making connections, it might be getting rid of connections, synaptic pruning. And that there was a comment that I forgot to say before about it's not just about connections going forwards in a facilitating kind of manner, is that you'll have some neurons that loop back and inhibit. So, and those inhibitory neurons, so the interneurons that are inhibitory, that stop firing, there's more of them than there are firing ones, facilitating ones. So actually a lot of learning is about inhibition, a lot of it. More is about inhibition than actual facilitation. So it's not moving stuff compared to moving stuff. That's the bigger learning thing. And, so I remember someone saying to me something about, oh, you say no a lot to your children. And I'm like, well, yeah, yes, because I need to know that that's no. Yes, for some things, no for a shitload more. You know, like there's a whole lot of stuff in the world that you can't do. And yeah, you can say no too much. I understand that. However, a fully functioning, efficient brain needs to understand no. It needs to understand inhibition. It needs to shut down certain things. You know, the inside voice and the outside voice, there's very separate things. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. It doesn't have to be punishing. Yeah. Does. It does. It does. As I used to say to the boys. And you know, there are elements of letting them figure out how to inhibit themselves. You know, like if you do that, and that's the consequences kind of learning, and we'll talk about that kind of learning in a couple of days' time as well. So there's a lot of synaptic pruning, a lot of this junking, getting rid of stuff that doesn't matter. And there are some theories around it's a lack of pruning in things like schizophrenia. It's a lack of pruning in some of the more pervasive developmental disorders. It's a failure to develop some of this tidying up operations, if you like, that lead to some of the brain disorders that we know about. Myelination. So this is another normal process of development that makes the brain more efficient, and that is, so I've talked about those little branches, like the axons and the dendrites. They have got this beautiful insulation kind of coating that means that they can pass on electrical signals really fast, because instead of it just kind of going blah, 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 the electric signals jump. So that's myelination, that insulation. So it means that nerves that can be really fast, like I can do that because I've got myelinated nerves. I've got other nerve fibers that are not myelinated, so that takes a long time to get the signal, like, some of the gut. The signals coming back from the gut to the brain are not myelinated, so it takes a long time to get back, relatively long time to get back to the gut, to the brain. So myelination is really important, and what's been relatively recently understood is that it takes a long time for people's brains to become fully myelinated and therefore fully efficient. And so for females, it's around 18, 19 years old that their frontal lobes, which is the last part to myelinate, are fully myelinated. And for blokes, on average, and again it's the average, is it can be up to 24. Yeah, so you're fine now. No, you're fine. So it doesn't mean to say that young folks' frontal lobes are not working at all. They're just not as efficient. Yeah. So, again, it's another example of understanding the brain helps us to understand people's behaviours a little bit. All right, so I reckon that's enough. So I think the next slide we go on to more neuroplasticity stuff. But these are sort of some processes that may or may not be of value to you in understanding us. All right. So yes. Okay, I'll say that. Yeah. 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 So the question is about the body sending the brain information all the time. I'm going to encourage you to think about, so I have a very neurocentric view of the world, and the nervous system, and so we talk about the brain as the nervous system, but the nervous system, the extensions of the brain in the nervous system throughout the whole body. Yeah. So actually structurally, your brain is everywhere. Your brain, yeah. So even, specialised fibres in muscles are nerve cells. They're part of the nervous system. So, yes, I think we can look at it that way. And again, that was what was really nice that came out of Cliff's thesis that I read last night, was this marrying of the sort of neurophysiology of the way we function with the experience that the informants were talking about feeling integrated, sort of at one with their bodies. And then he had a little bit about the neurophysiology sort of stuff. And it's a very nice way to conceptualize our experience. Yeah. So we'll continue on with that. All right, that's it. You asked for theory. Thank you. We go now. Where are we going to set up?